podemos começar. Good morning, everybody. Again, it is my pleasure to open the meeting, and it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Koshy Tharakan and to introduce Professor Tharakan, that is currently Associate Professor of the Department of Philosophy at Goa University. Professor Tharakan concluded his PhD at the University of Hyderabad, Telangana in India too, and his specialization areas are philosophy of social sciences and phenomenology, a little bit the fields we will discuss and on the talk he will present us. His current areas of research are philosophy of social sciences, phenomenology, environmental ethics, and hermeneutics. I'm sure that these are the fields from Professor Tharakan will talk to us on secularism, the creative transformation of a Western concept in the Indian ethos. This is the ideal subject to begin a meeting on Portugal and Goa, os Orientes e os Ocidentes, Portugal and Goa, the Easts and the Wests. So, Professor Tharakan, thank you so much for proposing us this subject that goes straight to the subject of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good morning to all my dear colleagues here. Before starting the presentation, let me make present before you our deep sense of gratitude for this invitation to be here today. And we have been visiting other universities also as part of a delegation. My colleague from Goa University is also here. Though he is not from the discipline of humanities, he is part of the delegation in his capacity as Director of Research. Well, the topic that I have chosen today is one of the hotly discussed topics in current philosophical deliberations, particularly political philosophical deliberations in India. But the concept is not anything new. It's quite an old notion. I mean, as you know, it originates in the 17th century, the notion of secularization. And again, before me going into the details of the presentation, let me make a caveat at the beginning that when I'm trying to say that the creative transformation of a Western concept, I'm not saying that secularism is a concept only which was available in the West, though the way in which it has been formulated during the historical period obviously has its roots in the West. That doesn't mean that the concept or its what you call iterations was never available to other cultures or traditions. This is basically because as a student of phenomenology, I believe that there is nothing called a pure culture, a culture which is totally cut off from the rest. Rather, there is a cultural give and take, exchanges, etc. So no culture, whether it is the West or the East, is in isolation. So the moment you talk about the origin, I mean, like the Foucaultian notion that it would be a problematic. But having said that, as I told you, as a political ideology, as a political concept, secularism obviously emerged in the West. I mean, initially the phrase secularization was used to refer to the kind of properties, issues which were attached to the church and religion being appropriated by the royal kings and princes, and that's the process which was known as secularization. So something which was earlier within the domain of the religion now becomes in the domain of the political. And this happens during the period of 1648 and on. French, the Revolution. And also around the same time, I mean, little later, you can see its resonances in the US understanding of secularism. So one of the French protagonists of the time, who was actually one of the aides of Napoleon, Talleyrand, in fact, talks about the concept of secularism as the process in which all ecclesiastical goods now being transformed at the disposal of the nation. That's how he defines. And he's one who, in a way, tried to make, at least in the French context, a rigid separation between the church and the polity. I mean, he's one of the architects, though in other aspects he was a bit controversial. But if you look at the etymology of this concept, secularism, I think from my readings about the topic, I understand that it was coined in 1851 only, the word secularism, though the process of secularization has been happening. The precise usage of the concept with this word secularism arose only in the 1851, and that too by a English rationalist, George Jacob, who even authored a small tract on principles of secularism. Well, the contemporary Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, well-known political and analytic thinker, Taylor makes a kind of distinction between two models of secular regime. What he calls, the one maybe can be broadly attributed to the French way of understanding secularism, and the other would be more of the US, the United States of American kind of understanding of secularism. And these two can be termed as, the first as a kind of republican model of secularism, the French Republic, the other one as a more libertarian concept of secularism. Now, the difference between the two models consists in the fact that in the first one, there is a strict wall of separation between religion and the state. Currently we see that model in operation in France, where the state can be officially associated with any religion, except perhaps in a very symbolic sense, like the Archbishop of Canterbury still is thought in England and also maybe some Scandinavian countries. But that's very symbolic, but nothing to do with the day-to-day governance. The other model, and which you see in the US, is articulated more in terms of having an equal treatment of religions. And that includes even those who do not believe in any Godhead, even atheists. So state has to maintain a strict sense of neutrality with regard to religious pluralism. And this you see mostly in the US context, this understanding of secularism. Now, if you look at these two models, and Taylor draws a beautiful parallel with the French goals of revolution, which, the slogans of French Revolution, if you go back, liberty, equality, and fraternity. You can see its resonance in the contemporary understanding of secularism. So Taylor would refer to it as the three dimensions of secularism. The first one, corresponding to the liberty aspect, he terms as religious liberty when it comes to secularism, which can be expressed by means of, you can express it in this way, that no one must be forced in the domain of religion or basic belief, including the freedom not to believe. That would succinctly capture the idea of liberty, particularly in the religious beliefs. The second dimension of secularism would be articulated in terms of the goal or value of equality between people, which may be expressed by saying that no religious outlook can enjoy a privileged position. In a way, some of the renditions about the Indian way of understanding secularism, particularly the way it has been practiced over the years, may be seen to have more relation with the second dimension of secularism. Particularly, there is this popular version of Indian secularism as Sarva Dharma Samabhava, the Sanskrit expression, which means that all religions with equal respect, treat all religions with equal respect. So it's not the first kind of French understanding of secularism where there is a strict separation between the two, rather to treat all religions fairly in an equal manner. Of course, there are certain problems there, we will come to discuss it as we progress. And the third dimension, which Taylor points out from the modern understanding of secularism, again corresponds to the French goals of the idea of a fraternity, a kind of being together, not so much of an individual exercise of freedom, but rather a coexistence of individuals as a community where there is a feeling of fraternity and togetherness. So that may be articulated in the contemporary idiom of secularism as all families, spiritual families, religious families must be heard, and it is included in the process of deciding, and they are consulted in the process of deciding what the society is about. In other words, the political identity of a community, a state, etc. are negotiated through interactions and discussions, dialogues between communities. So that gives the feeling of fraternity. Now, as I told you, these three goals, the dimensions of secularism which Taylor enunciates, correspond to the French understanding of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, the problem with the practice of secularism is that among these three values, there may be certain occasions where there is a conflict, and that's what the political theorists as well as statesmen have to confront. Though each of these values are equiprimordial, they are having the same primacy, they are equally valued, but still, in the realm of values, there is always a possibility of one value coming into conflict with the other, particularly with regard to certain issues. And that's the challenge of secularism in our times. Now, how to overcome these values? One of the suggestions which philosophers have expressed with regard to overcoming of these challenges is to articulate these values in terms of certain timeless principles, the kind of universalist principles. For example, Immanuel Kant's notion of ethics as a deontological principle where you can express the maxim in universalizable forms, so that irrespective of all context, irrespective of all differences, the principle would negotiate such differences. So articulate in terms of timeless principles. But Charles Taylor very sharply points out that when it comes to the practice, we do not see such timeless principles in operation. Or in other words, these timeless principles themselves can be questioned when there is a clash of values arise. Because the varied nature of situations which require different kinds of treatment of these principles, though the principles themselves are universal, the various situations may require different kinds of treatment of principles. To draw one example from Europe itself, both France and Germany have, though they have, the way they practice secularism, you can see the variation within their own understanding when it comes to the display of certain religious symbols in public places. France bans any such display of religious symbols in the public, whether it is wearing of the the hijab for the Islam practitioners of Islam women, or very prominent display of religious symbols on one's body, etc. No public places. You can have it at your own confined spaces, but it is not allowed. So it's strictly banned. But when it comes to Germany, for example, in the case of a French school children going to school in France, they are not supposed to wear those religious, anything to do with religious symbols. It's banned in France. Germany does it in a slightly different way. They would not object to the children or the school, children wearing that kind of religious symbols, but no teacher should do that. The idea is that any employee who is part of a public system cannot openly display his or her religious affiliations. So that's the German understanding. So you can see how both, though with regard to certain symbols, how they vary in the practice. That's what Taylor means by saying that situations are varied and you require certain kinds of different treatment. And if you, on the other hand, try to dictate these principles, ignoring such variations across cultures, and if you dictate these principles, then it violates the value of fraternity, which is embodied in the goals of the earlier way of talking about that correspondence between secularist principles and the libertarian values embodied in the French revolutionary goals. One of the ways to tackle this in Taylor's philosophy is to look slightly differently at this concept of secularism. Usually, all these problems arise, according to Taylor, because we understand or tend to interpret secularism as only about the state and religion. That's the commonsensical understanding, widely prevalent, even amongst political philosophers. That secularism is all about the relation between state and religion. Taylor is inviting us to look at it from a slightly different perspective. He would rather say that instead of looking at it as only an issue between the state and religion, look at it as a kind of goods, goods or merits about citizens, about the society, about the culture, which would perhaps give us some way of space to unpack these kinds of conflicts into a kind of harmonious negotiations. So the idea that secularism is only about state and religion, in fact, has come to us through history. The way it got developed in the West, as I told you, the way it originated, the two nations, US and France. So if you look at the history of its coming into the West, particularly the US and the French context, you can see that that's what made us to think that secularism is only about the relation between state and religion. But Taylor says it is incorrect to think that it's only about the relation between the two. Rather, it corresponds to a sense of diversity of the citizens, of the people, rather than the state and the religion. Which prompts us to ask this question: what is it for? What is it about? What is secularism for? Again, let us go back to the three dimensions of secularism, which consists of liberty, equality, and fraternity. If you look at the concept of secularism along these lines, you will see that it projects the ideal of secularism as concerned about people, about citizens, taken individually as well as collectively. Liberty, of course, would project individuality more. It gives a sense of priority to the individual when you talk about liberty, freedom of the individual. But fraternity, on the other hand, projects it on the collective. It projects, this again, the need separation between these two, when it is about society, you cannot institute a need separation between individual and society as understood as a whole. And again, going back to the ontological discussions, there is a tradition in philosophy of social sciences between how to frame explanations in social sciences, whether it should be in individualistic terms or in terms of holistic terms. The famous debate between sociologists like Durkheim and Max Weber, German, French. And it continues the tradition. But as Karl Popper has shown, it's not that, though he is not advocating for a holistic kind of understanding, he would say that it is neither too individualistic too it is individuals and their relations which makes it more than about the individual. Anyway, I was just talking about the ontological dimensions of it. So the idea here is that both the individual as well as the collective have its imprints on this concept. When you look at the concept of secularism as not just a relation between state and religion, state and church, but as about the people. Well, in which case, one can also argue that people with divergent perspectives, divergent viewpoints, though they may share a set of political principles, can yet differ in the way in which they understand the best means of securing those goods. I mean, this set of political principles is articulated in Rawlsian theory of justice in terms of what he calls the comprehensive use of the good. John Rawls would rather talk it as a comprehensive good. Whatever terminology you use, whether it's understood as a comprehensive good or as a set of political principles, doesn't matter. The point here is that there can be at the same time a shared set of values, but yet the way in which those values are understood to affect us may differ. I mean, to come back again to philosophy of science, let me bring this argument from work of Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn, very famous philosopher of science, talks about concepts as the possession of community. Whether it is of the natural scientific or social scientific, concepts are the possession of a community. It is from one community to another community that concepts make its travel. It is transferred. Now, across these communities, the concept may have some set of principles common. It may share certain common principles. But at the same time, the way they implement, and he draws this through the example of the understanding of astronomy. How the Japanese, he cites this in his work, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He says that the concept of heaven used in the sense astronomy, the skies, were different for the ancients and the moderns. Even today, when we look at it, the way, though we use the same names, but the categories to which they belong were different. In the earlier classifications, planets and comets and stars belong to one category, and so though astronomically speaking the concepts are there, the way we have categorized them differ. And that's what perhaps we mean by saying that though they share the same principles, the way in which it is implemented or interpreted are different. And that creates the tension. So translating these ideas into the realm of political philosophy and secularism, one can say that though there may be a shared set of principles, they differ when it comes to the deeper reasons for holding on to these principles. And there can be examples from the different philosophers, the way they understand ethics, Kant, utilitarians, and ethics. I'm not going into the details there. Just again to give a concrete example of these variations in interpreting the set of principles, it's a good example which I have taken from Charles Taylor. Taylor says that the first amendment, the US amendment, which has put this condition, requirement, that the Congress shall pass no law establishing religion or impeding the free exercise thereof. A principle, a universal principle in the context of American understanding of secularism. This is a principle. But look at the way it was differently understood then and now. The same principle, for example, one of the judges in the Supreme Court of USA in 1830, Joseph Story, saw it as to exclude all rivalry amongst Christian sects. When the principle says, Congress shall pass no law establishing religion or impeding the free exercise thereof, it is interpreted in a judicial way by saying that it excludes all rivalry among the different sects. So he says, this is part of the judgment that, or the standpoint that he has taken at that time. He says that Christianity is indispensable for the state because the belief in a future state of rewards and punishments is required for the administration of justice. Interestingly, in the Indian ways of understanding the everyday notions of justice, etc., is often articulated in ethnocentric concepts like karma, fate, etc. And these are certain notions that immediately the reaction would be that that's something to do with his karma, meaning the way he did certain things, etc. So this is what the Western context talks about, that future state of rewards and punishment is required for the administration of justice. That's how we interpret it. Now let's come to a contemporary philosopher in India, Rajiv Bhargava, Harvard-trained political thinker. It is doctoral studies from Harvard University, Rajiv Bhargava. Bhargava says that if you look at this trajectory of development of the concept of secularism, the United States gives priority to the dimension of religious liberty, which he calls the liberal concept of secularism, while France prioritizes equal citizenship, which he calls, as I referred to earlier, Taylor calls republican concept of secularism. Now, rather than having these two extreme views of secularism, Bhargava would call these two are the two outliers, two extreme understanding of secularism. There is another theory being now proposed, particularly from Britain, is in UK, Moderator, Tariq Moderator. He says that though these are two models, the French and the US, two models of secularism, as Taylor said, when it comes to actual practice, many of the Western nations actually practice what he calls moderate secularism, or in Moderator's word, accommodative secularism. I mean, the reasons for this moderation comes from what we nowadays call as the multiculturalist compulsions, the compulsions of multiculturalism. Now, why these compulsions of multiculturalism has to have its say when it comes to the concept of secularism, which, as we understood historically, has a very clear understanding of either a line of separation between the state and the religion or church, or equal treatment of all religions. Why that comes? It is because, again, in a multicultural society, the political identity is often articulated in terms of the identity of the communities. So it will be a plural identities rather than a singular identities. So this identity is often defined in terms of certain basic principles, of course, democratic nations, human rights, equality, all these kinds of basic principles, but it is also defined, at least to some extent, of their historical as well as linguistic and religious traditions. Given this divergence, my reading of the present, this is the topic that I have been giving the framework to put this reading that which I am trying to propose. It has a basis because, as I told you at the beginning itself, as I told you that in India it's a hotly debated concept, secularism. There are advocates for and against it, depending upon the political ideologies they subscribe to. There are die-hard advocates of secularism in the old Nehruvian model of secularism, as they call it. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, was a staunch believer of secularism, who wanted to have nothing of religion to do with the state. But it didn't develop in that way exactly, the way it evolved in Indian context. But at the same time, there were others, more inclined to the rightist ideology, who proposed that no, India should be a religious kind of a democracy, if not a theocratic kind of a democracy like the Islamist Middle East, etc. But still, being a predominantly Hindu nation, I mean, they talked about polity in terms of a religious ideology. So India should be a Hindu nation. And of contemporary India, there are these resonances these days because of the particular political configurations which has evolved. So that's why I said it's hotly debated. So, but again, it's not among the political practicing politicians or their followers that this happens. Though it happens at that time more what you call shrill. It was in a more shrill manner it is articulated. Even among academicians, there is a kind of what you call dispute about the need for secularism. For example, well-known sociologists like T.N. Madan would say that secularism, this famous article by Madan, which appeared in Sociological Review, is that secularism in its place, where he says that this concept has no utility for contemporary India. Because if it is understood as a strict separation between religion and state. Madan's reasons being that India was always a nation with deep sense of religiosity, sociologically speaking. You cannot separate the religious or spiritual aspirations of the people for their own, even political governance. So it has no space. And he is not the only one. There are others like Ashish Nandi, another famous social theorist, still alive. They are all. So, I'm not saying that it is only among the political ideologues that this, it's not between issue only between the rightist or the socialist, the Nehruvian socialist. It has its resonance even among well-reasoned academicians. So given this opposition, I am trying to understand the way in which, again let me, make it very clear, very open that why I subscribe to the value of secularism in the Indian context, and I believe that it has a value, not just for India, but for all democratic nations. But why do I believe? It's because India too is a multicultural society. It's not one religion, one nation, one language. As I often tell my friends from Portugal, that though both of us come from Goa, my colleague Professor Koshy is here, we do not share the same language. To communicate between us, we need to go back to English because he has a different mother tongue, I have a different mother tongue. We belong to two different religious beliefs, if at all. I'm not sure whether he's really a practicing person, but assuming, these are inherited things. We belong to two different traditions, religious traditions. Sometimes our food habits vary. So, it's just, and we are in the southern western region, and if you go to further north and further down south, that's right, even varies. So it's a divergent society. So you need to have a kind of negotiation. So then somebody would say, then rather than secularism, what you need is a multiculturalist values, and this is the tension which France is currently facing. The multiculturalists who would say that no, state cannot dictate that we should not wear these kinds of religious symbols, it's part of our way of life, we should be given respect for our, you should respect our cultures. But that's what I'm trying to resolve through this notion of Purusharthas. This is an Indian philosophical concept. Purushartha may be literally translated into English as aims of life. Artha actually in Sanskrit has different connotations. One of the meanings is object. So you have the term padartha, which refers to an object, but artha also has the connotation of meaning. Artha is synonym, meaning, yes. But Purushartha is usually translated as aims of life, meanings of life, purpose of life. Now these Purusharthas are often articulated in terms of four such values which govern the life of individuals as well as individuals in a society. That is the tension area we said, between liberty and fraternity in the Western context. Liberty which directly springs from the individual, and fraternity which talks about the collectivity. You can see its resonance here too. So you have these Purusharthas ordered in this manner. Again, there are slight variations, but I prefer this ordering, starting from dharma, which may be translated as moral values. Literally it means order, law, etc. Dharma. Some people loosely translate it as religion, though it is not just religion in the sense in which the West understands religion. Then comes artha, which may be equated with what we call material values, economic well-being, political resources, etc. You have karma, which is psychological kind of values, pleasure-seeking, satisfying of desires, etc. And finally, the concept of moksha, which has to do with what is called ultimate freedom or liberation or salvation, which are spiritual values. Now, the ordering, as I told you, I prefer this. This is there is again some difference among philosophers. Some people would start with karma. Kama, Artha, Dharma, Moksha. That would be the order. Starting from the third, then going to the second, then first and last four. They have their own reasoning. They would say that Dharma and Moksha are the Paramapurushartha. Moksha is the Paramapurushartha, the supreme, but Dharma is what aids that kind of a value. Moksha is led. Yeah, I'll soon explain this. Dharma is what guides one into. In other words, someone who lives according to the principles of Dharma would attain liberation. That's why they say Dharma and Moksha come together, whereas Artha and Kama are more individualistic. But why I say Dharma should come first, because this comes from Gandhian understanding of Purushartha. So as I told you, Purusharthas are broadly axiological. They refer to the comprehensive philosophy of life. One of the classical Indian thinkers, specialized in classical Indian philosophy, but a contemporary thinker, Mysore Hiriyanna, Professor Hiriyanna, well-known chronicler of classical Indian philosophy. Some of the well-known texts on Indian philosophy are authored by Professor Hiriyanna, long time back, personally. He would say that Purusharthas as value, it is more basic than of any other value. Purushartha is the most basic value. All other values are derivative from this, or they should be seen in the light of these values. Another well-known European champion of Indian philosophy, Karl Porter, not Karl Popper, Karl Porter, who is the compiler of the Encyclopedia of Indian Philosophy. It's a voluminous work, which was done by Karl Porter, University of Calgary, I think, Canada. He would interpret Purusharthas as attitudes. Attitudes directed towards greater and greater concern and less attachment. Again, I would prefer between these two Hiriyanna's reading of Purusharthas as values, particularly in the context of secularism, than merely an attitude. Just take 2 minutes and then. Now, if you look at this, you can clearly see that some of these are spiritual and some are secular values. Dharma and Moksha more to do with the spiritual aspects, whereas Artha and Kama, economic, political as well as psychological, more secular kind of values. Again, you can see Dharma as instrumental to the attainment of Moksha, which is intrinsic. So the distinction between instrumental value and intrinsic value, the same goes with Artha and Kama. Artha may be the instrumental value for Kama, which is intrinsic, pleasure in itself. And this is the reason why I said we prefer this order. Now, what is Gandhi's creative interpretation? As I told you, my presentation has this title, A Creative Transformation of a Western Concept. And this is what I see in Gandhi. That Gandhi has creatively interpreted this notion of Purusharthas, which now we could fit into the theory of secularism. Anthony Parel, a well-known Gandhian scholar, attributes this as an innovation that Gandhi has brought in to the domain of political thinking. Gandhi's innovation called for 3 deletion of the obsolete and the addition of the new. I mean both. He has removed certain things and brought forth something new. What was the innovative things that Gandhi brought? Of course, there are ideas like human rights, gender equality, secular state, which, as I told you, in the present context, largely came from the Western discourse on rights and duties and liberty, etc. Though, as I said, there is a problem in understanding all these as peculiar to only one culture, because there is always cultural transformation. Be that as it may, I'm not entering into that. But Gandhi adopts these ideas on his own terms. That is what we call creative transformation. So Gandhi updates the meaning of Purushartha by saying that Purushartha should be seen as a spiritual ability that humans have to grasp with regard to the goals of life, and once it is grasped, an individual has to pursue with the determination and skill which which is required to the realization of that. Whereas in the earlier times you can see, there was an attempt of harmonizing the value of karma and dharma. The desires, etc. should be within the bounds of morality. It cannot be a utilitarian pleasure seeking, or see, in India also there are philosophers of that temperament. We have a school of thought called Charvakas, Lokayatas, materialists, who would say that there is no afterlife, there is no soul, there is no life after, nothing, so enjoy your life to the fullest. Those are the Charvakas, but they were a minority. So in order to counter that kind of a perspective, there was always this requirement of harmonizing karma, that is pleasure seeking, with dharma. That is well taken. It's already there, available in the tradition. But Gandhi's innovation was to harmonize the values of artha and moksha, spiritual realization and economic political. In other words, in contemporary Western India, between secularism and spiritualism, secularism and religion, or religious pursuits. That's what Gandhi does, harmonizing these two values. So, in order to do that, he had to reconceptualize both the notions of artha, the secular, and moksha, the spiritual. How does he do that? Gandhi would say that in order to understand this, we have to understand the concept of power differently in various dimensions. Power in relation to state, Gandhi would say, it means establishing and maintaining a just and peaceful political community, fraternity, community, both national as well as international. When it comes to individual citizens, power should be understood as a means of engaging the highest form of public service, not aggrandizement of power to the privilege, but rather it's a matter of privilege of public service. Similarly, the new interpretation of moksha, according to Gandhi, does not require renunciation. The ancient understanding of moksha in the Indian context was those who are seeking moksha must renounce worldly pursuits. In the Sanskrit word, adopt sannyasa. Sannyasa, that is going into a kind of retreat from the worldly affairs. So renounce the world. Gandhi says no, moksha doesn't require renunciation. Rather, it requires renunciation of egoism. What is renounced to be? The ego, the self-centeredness. Again, it does not insist on a commitment to belief in a particular Godhead. Moksha doesn't mean a belief in a particular Godhead, liberation, salvation. Rather, a commitment to truth is enough. That's why Gandhi says, truth is God. I think I will stop here and then perhaps take it up for discussion, because I should not step into the time of the second speaker. Anything further, we can take it up for discussion. I mean, it's just if
you want to go to the concluding remarks.
No, that is the conclusion. Just you can say, I don't want to explain it. It's quite obvious. And it's one from Fred Dalmier, whose book Beyond Orientalism. He says the value of these kinds of going back to other cultures, rather than the obsession with Eurocentric notions, secularism, the way in which Eurocentric theorization portrayed it in terms of the French and the US understanding, strict separation and equal treatment. The value of going beyond that, that's what Dalmier talks about it. I have taken it from Dalmier's book Beyond Orientalism. He says, in a new and stunning Copernican revolution, the Eurocentric worldview of the past, with its corollaries of colonialism and Orientalism, has been replaced, or at least challenged, by the rise of a global arena in which non-Western cultures and societies are increasingly active participants in shaping the future of the world. So that gives me one reason for this reinterpretation. Then I am coming back to one of the thinkers from Portugal, Govindara de Sousa Santos, who in his work Epistemologies of the South, well-known political thinker, philosopher, jurist, attached to the University of Coimbra, but also teaches at Michigan, is global, UK, USA, and Goa. He was in Goa also a couple of years back. I had the opportunity to listen to him. So, Bhavendra Santos says that the emancipatory transformations in the world may follow grammars and scripts other than those developed by Western-centric critical theory. And such diversity should be valorized. We are widely diverse human beings, united by the idea that the understanding of the world is much larger than the Western understanding of the world. We believe that the transformation of the world may also occur in ways not foreseen by the global norm. So these are the reasoning behind looking at Gandhi's understanding of secularism beyond India. I mean, obviously Gandhi's concept of secularism has much larger relevance for India, but my reasoning to bring it to Europe is validated by these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you again, Professor Tharakan, for your wonderful talk. It was the perfect introducing of our meeting. It's a pity that we do not have time for questions, because we go to the second opening conference by Professor Dorothy Figueira. I'm sure that during the meeting we will have plenty of time to discuss and to ask you some on some of the aspects of your so rich talk. Thank you again.
Georgia, Atlantic, United States, and she's from the other side of the coin, not philosophy, but essentially literature. So we are a bit late. I'm sorry. You can see in the internet how famous she is, and I will give you the word just to begin the session. Because the more important is certainly to hear what she has to say.
I could have spoken about Goa and Portugal. I've worked extensively on Portuguese travel narratives to India, but I chose instead to talk about a current project I'm working on, which deals with strange readings of the Bhagavad Gita. And I chose this topic for this conference because I think it deals with a substantial problem that's an issue here in intercultural analyses. This encounter between East and West and the ethical components. So while I'm not dealing precisely with India, or with Goa and Portugal, I am dealing with something which underpins this entire invention, this entire intellectual quest in terms of the exoticism and sometimes the decadence involved in these encounters. So this larger project deals, as I said, it's a cross-cultural project dealing with Indian readings of the Gita, Tilak, Ambedkar, Gandhi, etc. And there is a Western component dealing with the Germans, some French people, and this is a short summary of the American encounter with India. Indologists, or Indian studies scholars, have claimed that the Western scholarly reception of the Bhagavad Gita contributed to the refusal on the part of the philosophical establishment to take India seriously. And indeed, the Hindu Song of the Lord has had a varied and controversial life in the West. In its own context, the Gita promotes devotion to Lord Krishna, the mystical bond between the devotee and the Godhead, and a philosophy of action, or karma, and knowledge, jnana. It was the first Sanskrit text translated and published in the West, spawning commentaries by August Wilhelm Schlegel, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and Hegel. Embraced in the West as the Bible of Hinduism, it influenced Whitman, Emerson, T.S. Eliot. More recently, the Gita made a splash on the operatic stage in Satyagraha, an opera by the American composer Philip Glass. In this essay, I'll outline the initial Western reception of this Hindu sacred text. In previous publications, I've examined how the European search for models in an Indian exotic ultimately collided with a vision of fatalism. Today, I'll summarize this inquiry and expand it to investigate American readings of this emblematic Sanskrit text. I wish to question whether the early European responses to the Gita resonate in its subsequent American reception. In 1785, Charles Wilkins translated the Gita from Sanskrit into English. Wilkins' rendition was the most important Sanskrit philosophical translation of its time, determining the view of Indian philosophy that European intellectuals would initially form. August Wilhelm Schlegel then published in 1823 the Sanskrit text of the Gita, along with a Latin translation, of which the French Sanskritist A.S. Langlois wrote a scathing review. Wilhelm von Humboldt subsequently responded to this review with his essay on the Gita. Humboldt, who also knew Sanskrit, expounded upon the central theme of the Gita, that one should perform one's duty without any regard for the fruits of one's actions. Humboldt's exposition of the Gita did not escape Hegel's notice. The philosopher had initially discounted Indian thought, but now realized that he had to address what he perceived as its deleterious influence. Hegel interpreted the Gita's message that the individual soul must recognize its intrinsic identity with the universal as a call to immobility and inaction. He based his analysis largely on the translation of the term yoga. Wilkins had glossed yoga as the application of the mind in spiritual matters and the performance of religious ceremonies. Schlegel, unfortunately, had translated this term as devotio. Hegel opted, however, for vertiefel, in the sense of absorption, finding Wilkins' gloss unwieldy and Schlegel's translation inadequate. But Hegel's difficulty in finding an adequate translation for the term yoga was not just semantic quibbling. It stemmed rather from problems he had with the very issue of the impossibility of translation itself. Hegel held that meaning was not transferable and original theoretical meaning is of necessity lost. Thus, the practice of translation in general posed a fundamental epistemological problem for Hegel. Humboldt, like Herder before him, had eschewed any temptation to compare. His universalism rejected arguments of commensurability. Humboldt, therefore, avoided setting value judgments upon Indian philosophy in his discussion of the Gita. Hegel, however, was all about value judgments, especially when he perceived that some system of thought threatened his own. The discussion concerning the inadequacy of translating the term yoga led Hegel to postulate a theory concerning the impossibility of translation in general due to the incommensurability of source and target languages. Hegel's judgment established a justification for free and creative translations. Just as Hegel felt unconstrained in offering imprecise and fragmentary renditions of the Gita, so did its initial American readers. Perhaps the first literary reference we find to the Gita in American letters was Emerson's comment that Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was, quote, a mixture of the Bhagavad Gita and the New York Tribune. Thus, from the very beginning of its reception in the U.S., parallels were drawn between the Sanskrit mystical poem and Whitman's poetry. Thoreau even asked Whitman if he had read the Indians, and Whitman replied in the negative. Given Whitman's cursory method of reading, pursuing a dozen books at a time, reading a few pages here and there, and seldom getting sufficiently interested in any volume to read it entirely, his response might well be true. Yet Horace Traubel claimed that Whitman had told him that he was very familiar with the Gita and saw it as a formal classic. Also, in the poem A Backward Glance Over Traveled Roads, Whitman claims to have knowledge of the, quote, ancient Hindu poems. Since the Gita was the only poem translated at the time, he may well have read it before the first edition of The Leaves of Grass. However, all one finds in Whitman are echoes of Indian philosophy and superficial references to Sanskrit terms. In the Song of Myself, he evokes the Shastras and the Vedas, Brahma and the Gymnosophists. In Salut au Monde, Whitman speaks of Indian holy cities and their plagues. Aside from these vague evocations and general praise for the genius of India, there's no evidence to show that Whitman was directly inspired either by India or by the Gita. Whitman's idea of the soul, the concept of the self as a unifying entity that is permanent, indestructible, eternal, and all-pervading, is similar to that found in the Gita and the Upanishads. But such a vision of the cosmic self is not unique to Indian thought and common to most mystical literature. In other words, Whitman's pantheistic worldview is not exclusively Indian. Moreover, he did not believe in certain central tenets of Hinduism expressed in the Gita. He did not accept that life is an illusion, Maya, and he certainly did not discount the physical body or in any way believe in the subjugation of the senses. In fact, in the Song of Myself, he called for a surrender to the senses. Whitman's references to Sanskrit terms were evocative rather than substantial. He incorporated them in his poetry, perhaps to valorize and legitimate his pantheistic worldview. Whitman was a 19th century exoticist, a little less well-read than others. In contrast to Whitman, Emerson was knowledgeable about Indian literature and studied some Sanskrit at Harvard. While critics ascribe the poems Hamatraya and Brahma to Emerson's knowledge of the Vishnu Purana, these two poems actually reflect far more his knowledge of the Upanishads. Hamatraya was Emerson's variant on the spelling of the name of the famous Upanishadic female seer, Maitreya. And his poem Brahma is derivative to the point of plagiarism of key passages from the Katha Upanishad. Emerson held India in high regard, claiming it was a transnational book that was unparalleled in wisdom. Moreover, he accepted the necessity that Krishna lays on Arjuna, that he must fulfill his duty and fight. Contrary to the quietism that Hegel read into the text, Emerson felt that the Gita does not prevent us from acting. The message of Emerson's essay, The Oversoul, that we all rest in the great nature and that it contains every man's particular nature, clearly evokes Arjuna's order to Krishna on the battlefield, as does Emerson's lecture, The Affection, where he defines courage as a belief in the identity of the nature of one's enemy with one's own nature. Unlike Whitman, Emerson was willing to accept the illusoriness of the world, as he does in the poem Brahma. In terms reminiscent of the Gita, Emerson instructs us that we should battle because all is illusion and it is necessary to act, as if one not acted. T.S. Eliot shared Emerson's admiration for the Gita, claiming it was the next greatest poem after the Divine Comedy. Eliot also shared Whitman's and Emerson's habit of using the Sanskrit language in the service of poetry. His most famous appropriation of Sanskrit terminology is found in The Wasteland, which he concludes with the customary formal closure of all Upanishads, Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace. But earlier in the same poem, in section 5, What the Thunder Said, Eliot teases his readers with other Sanskrit terms. He repeats the rumblings of thunder that he borrows from the Hindu god Prajapati, and he requisitions the injunction from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Datta, give, Dayadvam, sympathize, Damyata, control. Here, Eliot uses Sanskrit terms much in the same way that he quotes from Dante or Rimbaud. They serve pretentiously evocative aims. Moreover, it's worth noting that after Eliot has the thunder god speak Sanskrit, he then has his words interpreted by Western voices. Can we say that Eliot uses Sanskrit terms as a means of rejecting the possibility of interpretation in much the same way as Hegel did? Eliot had studied Sanskrit extensively at Harvard upon his return to his studies in 1913. He read and annotated the Gita and immersed himself in Indian philosophy. After a few years, however, he gave up the study of Indic philology and philosophy, claiming in After Strange Gods, in 1934, that all it left him with was a state of enlightened mystification. But in reviewing his poetry, particularly in the third quartet, it is clear that he had an adequate understanding of the Gita. Dry Salvages features the Gita's battle scene where Krishna justifies the killing of his kin to Arjuna, who shrinks from battle. Krishna urges Arjuna to fulfill his dharma and play at his appointed role in the cosmic drama. One cannot comprehend the Lord's will. I sometimes wonder what Krishna meant. That's in line 124. Eliot adds that one should act without being concerned with the fruits of one's actions. Quote, and do not think of the fruit of action, line 161. He does not conclude his poem by saying farewell, but rather, fare forward, voyager. Here's the quote. So Krishna, as when he admonished Arjuna on the field of battle, not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers. That's line 166 to 69. These sentiments are exactly what Krishna admonishes Arjuna to do in the Gita. Antakale cha mameva smaramutva kalivaram ya prayati sa madhavam yati nasht yatra samshaya. Quote, translation, and who at the time of death thinks of me alone, leaves the body and goes forward. He reaches my being, there is no death. The voyagers can be saved if they heed the advice of Krishna and only perform action without thoughts of the self. In his advice, Eliot is essentially paraphrasing the above quote from the Gita. Gita is 8.5. One can die at any moment, not the imminent death facing Arjuna, so one should be intent on the highest sphere of being and thus fructify the lives of others. Eliot was not focusing on the soul as unborn, eternal, and everlasting, as in Whitman and Emerson, or the world of illusion. What he took from the Gita is the concept of the disinterested action, the karma yoga. It is Arjuna's duty, his dharma, to fight. But Eliot completes Krishna's words with an important modification. Whatever one dwells on, one attains upon death, i.e., is fructified in the next life if one is reborn. Here, Eliot expresses the central truth of the Gita 8:6 through 7, yam yam vat smaram bhavam tyajyayante kalevaram tam tam evaite kaunteya sudha tadbhava bhavati. Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu mam anusmara yudya cha Maya arpita manobudir mam evash yasham samshayam. Translation: on whatever being one is thinking at the end of when one leaves the body, that being alone, O son of Kunti, one reaches when one constantly dwells on that being. Therefore, at all times meditate on me and fight with mind and reason fixed on me. You shall doubtless come to me. But contrary to the Gita's injunction that disinterested action leads to one's salvation, understood in the Hindu context as release from rebirth, Eliot speaks of the fructification in the lives of others. At the moment which is not action or inaction, you can receive this. Of whatever sphere of being the mind of a man may be intent at the time of death, that is the one action at the time of death is every moment, which shall fructify in the lives of others. This is from Dry Salvage's lines 155 to 60. It's not without significance that Eliot chose to quote Krishna's command to fight in 1941. He was signaling the Gita's teaching that since the unchanging spirit does not dwell in the moral body, one should continue to act and fight on the battlefield without attachment to the world. In this context, we must not forget Robert Oppenheimer's quote from the Gita 2:32 upon the first detonation of the atom bomb, where Oppenheimer famously said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of the worlds." I have another chapter on Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was fast. It's very interesting how they all did the basic 2 years of Sanskrit at Harvard. Oppenheimer did 2 years of Sanskrit at Harvard. Eliot did 2 years of Sanskrit at Harvard. Emerson did a little bit of something. I did 2 years of Sanskrit at Harvard. I had Emerson's room at Harvard, which I accidentally set on fire. But that's another story. Yeah, it was a date with my to-be husband, and I set a fire, and I set it on fire. But that's neither here nor there. So what I think is interesting here is that Eliot evoked the Gita seems to be rather... Eliot is evoking the Gita. It's almost a cottage industry at this point. Everyone is quoting the Gita, from Whitman, Emerson, Thoreau, Eliot, Oppenheimer. The Gita is the text to go to when one wants to say something profound. And people either understand it or don't understand it, or they just play with the exoticism of the Gita. So the Gita becomes this emblematic alibi for many, many things going on at the same time. But in case of Eliot, who was, I think, of course, the most intelligent in terms of Indian thought, because he'd studied Indian philosophy extensively, he was telling his readers that they should not be concerned with their own fate, but with the good of mankind. It's 1941. Eliot appropriated the Gita in dry salvages in order to Christianize its message and urge his fellow citizens to fight the Nazis for the greater good of the nation and humanity. What we've seen how Whitman and Emerson use of the Gita exhibits two tendencies: a superficial use of Sanskrit terminology for its evocative potential, and a conscious attempt to cull some religious meaning from this exotic text. Eliot was far more knowledgeable in his appropriation, using the Gita as an inspirational springboard for his wartime reflections on human and social responsibility. All these American poets, however, paid little attention to the implications of their appropriations of the sacred texts. One might even say that they set the stage for Philip Glass's misappropriation of the Gita in his opera Satyagraha. Has anyone seen this opera? It's weird. Okay, this opera, which premiered in 1979, provides a hagiographic interpretation of Gandhi's development in South Africa of a philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience. Glass devoted the opera to Gandhi because he felt that the Mahatma was the inspiration for all subsequent dissident movements, and he even claimed that Gandhi's legacy had been assumed by contemporary artists such as himself. The entire libretto consists of 20 excerpted verses from the Gita. The opera opens with a battle array represented in the Gita, with Gandhi situated between the warring factions. Glass has him singing Krishna's words as well as Arjuna's responses. In effect, God, in the form of Krishna, is rendered silent and replaced by Gandhi, who also assumes Arjuna's moment of doubt. The action then moves to Gandhi's South African agrarian collective, to his journalist, moves to the agrarian collective, to his journalistic activities in Durban, and then returns to the battlefield of the Gita to portray the Newcastle March where Gandhi persuaded the South African miners to strike. The opera concludes with Gandhi alone on stage with Martin Luther King and Tolstoy, suspended in the air, looking down on Gandhi. Glancing upward toward King, Gandhi again sings Krishna's words. As much as I'd like to criticize Glass's venture, we must realize that this opera is not as radical as it might at first seem. Granted, Glass has taken historical material and mythologized it. But the mythologization of history is common to opera, as in the case of Bellini's I Puritani and Donizetti's Anna Bolena or Maria Stuarda. As a medium, opera is self-consciously a myth-making enterprise. So Glass's mythologization of Gandhi's career is not without precedent, nor are Glass's fanciful motifs in any way extraordinary, since as an art form, opera deliberately and ostentatiously brackets off reality. While the libretto in Sanskrit is irksome, there are no subtitles in any production that's been made up until now. And also the librettist did not know Sanskrit. She sort of taught herself Sanskrit, so the Sanskrit of the libretto is deformed, and she had no idea of her pronunciation. So it's a very odd Sanskrit that we're producing here. So it's irksome, but the idea of incomprehensible libretti are not unknown, even in languages far more understandable to the opera-going public than a dead Indian language. By the 1750s, Italian opera had become largely incomprehensible, with its emphasis placed on vocal display and acrobatics. That the audience of Satyagraha cannot understand the libretto is not an exceptional occurrence. What is interesting is that the Sanskrit verses chosen for the libretto, even if understood, have absolutely no relation to the action and are uniformly mispronounced. Nevertheless, whatever reservations one might have about the liberties Glass took with the historical record and with the Sanskrit text fade into obscurity when one views Achim Freier's 1983 production, where the Gita battlefield becomes a circus filled with absurd props, trapeze artists, and a Gandhi who holds a huge barbell that bends to the floor while he sings, tripping about under its weight. The agrarian collective is presented as a dystopia with rags on the floor, where the actors move aimlessly, reposition ladders, and run in place to somehow depict Gandhi's vow of civil disobedience. Freier's second act opens in a bar with dwarves serving drinks from cocktail shakers and crawling menacingly after Gandhi. In the final act, a blue electric snowman with a dove over his head wheels in as the finale, and an army of zombie-like figures in slow motion advance amidst red lights, Nazi costumed guards, and police dogs. Even if we acknowledge that opera as an art form is licensed to entertain both the irrational and the hysterical, we can safely conclude that with Freier's production, it becomes simply kitsch. In conclusion, this brief overview has tried to show how the early Western reception of the Gita introduced several hermeneutical problems involved in engaging the other. In their initial translations and commentaries, Schlegel, Humboldt, and Hegel questioned how philosophical thought could be understood outside its own tradition. In contrast to Schlegel and Humboldt, Hegel foreclosed the very possibility of such understanding when he rejected the notion of a common universal meaning and inflicted the standards from one culture, his own, upon another, the Indian. The impossibility of reading the other with a European mode of understanding results in nothing more than an appropriation and colonization of the other, since the hermeneutical project has been aborted. We have also seen how the resulting lacuna can subsequently be filled in by popular notions of the esoteric and the occult East. Whitman, Emerson, Eliot, and Philip Glass all exhibit this tendency. The Gita did not function as itself, but rather as an exotic tool. Whitman probably borrowed from its mystic vision to support his pantheism. Emerson was somewhat more serious in his expropriation of the Gita, to the degree that he actually plagiarized it. This poem, Brahma, is literally a quotation from the Katha Upanishad. Eliot understood the Gita best, even if he used it as an exotic vehicle for his Anglican message. For these American poets, the Gita, as a sacred text, performed in a sacred language, added gravitas, legitimacy, and a mystical allure to their work. But all this exotic borrowing suggests a less radical and, might I say, decadent and exclusionary interpretation. Beginning in the 19th century, India supplied Westerners with an alibi in the true sense of the term, and elsewhere onto which they could project their longings. People who are world-weary or have lost faith can seek in the Indian exotic a new system of belief. They can travel farther from home than the ordinary seeker of truth. Esoteric quests are therefore not egalitarian. They tend to foster elitism. It suits those for whom quotidian experience does not suffice, those who seek the superordinate in order to invest their existences with greater value and intensity. In other words, it suits philosophers, poets, and artists, those very individuals who arrogantly believe that while the divine spark is present in us all, not everyone is capable of reuniting his spark with the divine. Those engaged in a Promethean flight are often attracted to the exotic precisely because of its elitist potential. When Glass travels to India on Rockefeller money to explore spirituality in 2-month installments, he is even more insufferable than those poets who sprinkled their work with colorful Sanskrit words. Freier's production of Glass's operatic Gita brings me back to Hegel. I think we can all agree that Hegel deserved our opprobrium for refusing to make a place for India in world philosophy. And I think we can acknowledge and respect the imperfect attempts of Schlegel, Humboldt, Emerson, and Eliot to engage Indian religious thought. But how should we read Glass's insertion of himself as an avatar of Gandhi, the dissident? Are we supposed to accept this self-serving and grandiose equation? And how should we respond to Fryer's trivialization of the Gita in a Cirque du Soleil setting, with Gandhi stumbling under barbells, attacked by drunken Nazi dwarves, and seeing the Gita to Glass's repetitive ascending and descending scales in mispronounced Sanskrit? What would have been the reception of an opera that used the Quran in such a fashion? These various readings of the Gita should give us pause. Once the persona of the translator, the poet, or the artist overshadows the texts, we then become engaged in a process of self-reification from which little enlightenment can be expected. Thank you.
Hoping that this paper could promote the dialogue between two conferences, if you don't mind.
No.
Because we are late. Because we are discussing here the dialogue promoted by translation and perhaps lost in translation between the two conferences, and to discuss here the possibility of the understanding of another culture, of another text or religion. So if anyone of the public yes.
I have a question to Professor Koshy. It's not exactly a question, more an observation. You pointed a difference between secularism in the United States and in France, in Europe generally. You talked about a liberal vision and a republican vision. In my point of view, the main difference is not exactly that difference. I would say that when we talk about secularism, there are two visions, two main visions. One defends that religion is a good thing to each person, to the society in general. And therefore, the state, in that vision, the state must support not one religion in particular, but all religions. In the second view, religion in maximum is object of tolerance. We tolerate religion, but we don't support religion. You understand?
You want me to respond? I agree with you this interpretation.
You can jump.
No, it's just no, it's not. And I see your point that, of course, when I talk about moderate secularism, it's to bring back this value of religion, to see religion as a public good. Even if one is not spiritually oriented. It's a public good in the sense that there are various other functions that religion brings into the society as more good interpret. Maybe public service, hospitals, schools, etc. are supported by the religion. So that religion as a good in contemporary society is well taken. When it comes to toleration, what is the spring of that toleration? That's my question. And I would say that is the value of liberty that the US model would say that each individual has the liberty of conscience of subscribing to a view, which necessitates, in order to honor that liberty, you need to have that kind of maximum toleration. And toleration would perhaps may have a little negative connotation.
Yes.
So that's the reason I
have the vision of Auguste Comte, for example, positivism.
Right.
The vision that defends religion, it's not the last step. So it's not a positive thing.
Right. So here's the point. So your own articulation of this actually frames it in terms of the citizen or the subject or the people, rather than as a confrontation between state and the church. Charles Taylor was pointing out to this danger of seeing secularism as a conflict between the state and that's why Purushartha and Gandhian revelation of putting the individual to the fore.
But my understanding, my question was this: Taylor's discussion of secularism is absolutely the same as his discussion of multiculturalism,
right.
And as Stanley Fish has shown, and more importantly, Zizek has shown, this notion of multiculturalism or secularism as it encodes tolerance is only good as far as your tolerance encounters the intolerance of the other, and then everything falls apart. So I think the same problem, we can see the same problem with Taylor's notion of secularism, as we saw, which was fairly seriously debunked by both Stanley Fish and Slavoj Žižek, that in theory it's wonderful, but the reality is that confrontation of tolerance with intolerance breaks down the secular ideal, as we see in the communalism in India now, and once our tolerance hits someone else's intolerance, that's the end of the game.
So, I agree. So that is because you are privileging only the notion of liberty there. The tolerance equated with liberty. And that is a need. I think I would give a more beneficial reading of Taylor there, saying that you also equally projects the value of fraternity. And rightly he says that there will be a conflict. I agree, there will be a conflict and then it breaks down. So the notion of Purushartha, the way Gandhi tried to understand it, to some extent, I'm not saying no philosophy for that matter can offer a final solution for all different situations, but rather than deviate, rather than subscribing to the conventional, traditional understanding of secularism as a kind of a concept which articulates only the relation between the state and the church or religion, you need to see it from the perspective of individual. So it is an evolving process. It is not a finished theoretical concept. And that's the reason why Bhagavad says that. Raji Bhagavad says that secularism is not a static concept. It's always evolving. And the way contemporary India understands it is still open for further negotiations and readings. And that's my point, that we need to look into these kinds of dynamics of the concept.
And it can solve by dialogue.
Yeah. It's a challenge, I agree. It's a challenge. It's fraught with contestations, debates, etc. It's not something which you can easily categorize as the secular and the sacred. That kind of a sharp distinction is being erased even in the Indian practice. The Indian practice is termed as principled distance, Bhagavad's term. He uses the term principled distance. Now, principled distance is contextual always. Okay. So one can always open it for challenges and criticisms. And that's the fate of the concept, perhaps.
Yes, I would continue on France because I come from the University of Bordeaux in France. So we are confronted with that problem all the time. And in France, secularism is the famous word laïcité.
Yeah.
And it has become a real religion in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Laïcité has become a real religion in France and has radical forms as religions have. So I think that's a real subject of reflection in itself. How these concepts of secularism, laicity, can become religions in themselves and radical as far as they are religions. So, it was an observation.
Well taken. There are critics, even in India, who would say that secularism itself becomes a religion and it imposes the way in which the West has tried to secularize the thing which has no relevance for India. So that's the criticisms even come from some of the Indian political ideologues. But the point is that you also should view India as a multicultural entity. So that my way of looking at it is this tension between multiculturalism and some sort of a political identity which any nation has to have. Without it, that the political concept, I mean, if you give a free hand to multicultural identities, there is nothing which holds the center. I mean, as perhaps Keats would say, that center can no longer hold, things fall apart. We cannot have that kind of a political disintegration as far as the Indian context is concerned. It will have larger repercussions. So given that challenges of multiculturalism, and given also this problem of secularism itself becoming another religion, monolithic, statist kind of religion, perhaps this notion of principal distance articulated in terms of a Gandhian ethos maybe a way we need to explore it. It was a well, it's my question is to possible. Thanks for a scholarly presentation. So my question is this: are you therefore alluding to the dangers of concepts, philosophies being interpreted outside the context of its?
No, I'm merely pointing out the fact that at least the study of philosophy, the discipline of philosophy, at least in America, and I believe elsewhere, has absolutely ignored Indian philosophy because they saw it as intrinsically associated with Indian religion. So you'll never study Indian philosophy in the philosophy department. And I think that goes back to Hegel. That goes back to the fact that Hegel was very annoyed that he had to ultimately, with these translations of the Gita period, he had to ultimately take Indian thought seriously. And his way of taking Indian thought seriously was to distort it and to give it this fatalistic worldview, to which other philosophers subsequently, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and everyone went crazy with. My only issue is that we have to think, when we're talking about East-West relations, we have to think about what the dynamic is. We have to think what the dynamic is in the manner in which the history of the reception of the text and the manner in which it's distorted, because unfortunately in these encounters there's something beyond the clearly sort of factual transferal of one set of ideas to another worldview. And I think in the case of India, there's this whole level, and all of my research has been on this level of this exoticism. My first book dealing with the translations of the Sanskrit, my second, another book on the decadence. These are quests, these are exotic quests. And oftentimes, looking to see what India says is not really at issue. What is at issue is what one wants to project onto India to complete oneself. And so you have this notion of the projection and the fictionalization of Indian thought. And then, of course, there is that underside of exoticism that we see with someone like Julius Evola, even to a certain extent Merceliani. There's something else going on in these exotic quests. There's something a little darker going on here in terms of this voyage over, prioritizing of the self, valorizing the self through this other, and then with a round-trip ticket, as V.S. Naipaul would say. You come back because, and in the process, you yourself are valorized. And I think it's something like Glass, taking Rockefeller money and going off to his little yoga retreats and then writing this terrible opera. It's a very clear sign of this exoticism for exoticism's sake. That really, India doesn't exist as qua India. It exists as a vehicle for me to feel more important for myself and more important to others. I always jokingly said when I was studying history of religions, before I went into literature, that you never found any African-American students of Hinduism. You never found any Puerto Rican students of Hinduism. You have to have a sense of your own culture to reject that culture, go and seek fulfillment elsewhere, come home with it as a more valuable person. So there is this whole sense of these exotic emotions. August Wilhelm Schlegel had to have that job in Bonn as the first Sanskrit professor in order to dress up as a fakir. Any other German anyone else dressing up as a fakir would be a fool. But Schlegel had his position. He could play act at being I'm interested in the play acting aspects of this whole thing. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind when we're talking about these encounters. They are,
And if I was,
we're looking for truth. Yes, we're looking for truth. We're looking for inspiration. Goethe, looking for inspiration in Persia, looking for inspiration in Shakuntala. But on the other side, there's also something else going on. There's a certain self-reification that's being affected, and there's a certain appropriation for exploitation. Intellectual exploitation. And you look, as you said, you look at all these literateurs, you look at all these poets, you look at everyone who does their little dabbling. In India, sometimes it's on a superficial level, look at Deleuze. Sometimes it's on a more profound level, T.S. Eliot. Sometimes it's idiotic, Philip Glass. And I think that's what I find very interesting. And the only reason I went on this thing, I have to tell you, this goes back to my Portuguese roots. As a Portuguese Italian American, when I was studying these things, I was not studying them as a tourist. I was studying them because I did not feel at home in my immigrant culture. The other people were going off to India. Their hair smelled of incense. They dressed up in Indian garb. My approach to this was very different than white American approach to this. And I realized there was a difference in what I was looking for, which was more just sort of curiosity, and what they were looking for, or what they felt they had the right to find in the other. They had their sense of culture, they had their sense of belonging, so they could be a tourist vis-a-vis India. I never had that sense of belonging to be a tourist vis-a-vis India. And so what did that say about culture and one's grasp of culture, or one's belonging to culture? You have to belong to a culture to be able to reject it and go somewhere else. Why would someone become a Hindu or a Buddhist when you can become a Hasidic Jew, or you could become an evangelical Christian? It's closer to home. Why do you go that far away? Because you can afford to. So I think that's what fascinates me in this I think we cannot look at this in neutral terms. And that's what I wanted to sort of open up the session with, the idea that when we think of intercultural encounters, they're never neutral. And the level of the politicization is not this Saidian notion of everything has to follow into some Orientalist binary. I think it's on a very deeper level of political than merely empire.
I'm sorry, we are very late. I think we can now become travelers, and also to continue to think about this, because I think this is the center of the question in those dialogues between Occident and Orient. But time is passing, and others must talk too. So we are making a small pause with 5 minutes, just 5 minutes to rest a little, to speak a little with the audience. Thank you.